I have a few videos in progress. An analysis of Nier Automata, a comparison of the difficulty of Fury and Cuphead and why one works for me while the other doesn't, an analysis of the early access roguelite Dead Cells and why its combat is so damn satisfying, and of course, a piece on the best games I've played this year. But I've got to interrupt that programming to address something so big and so annoying I don't have the energy to go into the detail I normally do. Destiny 2 is a bad game. It was a bad game on the day it released, it was a bad game during the beta, it was a bad game the moment it was conceptualized. And the reason it's a bad game is because it wasn't made for the people who like Destiny. It was made for people who do not like Destiny. And that ends up being a lesson on arrogance, vision, and losing sight of who your audience is. If you like what I have to say, or how I sound saying it, do us both a favor and click the like and subscribe buttons and comment down below. Full confession, I played a depressing, absurd, disgusting amount of Destiny. Like well over 1,000 hours. Over 1,500 hours. Entire months of my life were spent playing Destiny when you add all that time up. So while I may not be an authority on much, I can confidently say I am an authority on what people who really like Destiny like. And Destiny 2 is not what people who like Destiny 1 like. We're going to examine what made Destiny 1 so great, and how Destiny 2, in search of an audience it was never intended to appeal to, changed the game so much it now has no audience at all. As always, let's get a brief history out of the way. Bungie started out as a small studio making well-received games like Minotaur, as well as some early innovative FPS titles, but it did not rise to prominence until it released a little-known console exclusive called Halo. Halo became a cultural phenomenon because it brought the competitive online multiplayer FPS genre into living rooms that finally had reliable internet connections with consoles that could finally handle those games, and because it also featured a rich campaign with a good story and compelling lore. It also didn't hurt that the main story of the games was one of religious war that released only a couple of months after the 9/11 attacks. After making several Halo games under the umbrella of Microsoft, Bungie became independent again after shipping the excellent Halo Reach and began working on their next big project. An innovative new game that combined the persistent online worlds of the MMO genre with the gunplay and space opera settings of Halo. The company signed a massive publishing deal with Activision Blizzard and in 2013 announced Destiny. Destiny was originally promised to be the first ever FPS MMORPG. For people like me, that sounded like a dream come true. I made hundreds of friends playing Destiny, and I found tons of men and women who, like myself, had played World of Warcraft for years before eventually finding the core gameplay to be too passive. Although WoW still holds a special place in my heart, modern gaming has left the MMO genre behind. We all expect much more interactive combat mechanics in our games these days, and the moment-to-moment gameplay of the FPS genre has broad appeal to gamers of all ages. For many of us, Borderlands 2 had scratched an itch we didn't know we had, while proving that deep RPG and loot-based leveling could work flawless in an FPS game. And our hopes for Destiny was for it to be Halo crossed with Diablo. Now let's leave aside the significantly smaller scope than promised that Destiny released in. Let's leave aside the small world and lack of story, leave aside the baffling decision in an online game to not have any proximity chat or matchmaking for endgame activities. Leave aside even the entirely predictable disaster that balancing PvE and PvP together would be. The core mechanics of Destiny were, right from the beta, near perfect. Supers felt super. Grenades were powerful, and the speed and movement of the game, while not Titanfall, were light years faster than most FPS games on the market at the time. When people talk about how good shooting aliens feels in Destiny 1, I think they're actually, without realizing it, referring to the movement system. Very quickly, combat scenarios became airborne affairs. The game was a constant blur of motion, and you were more likely to shoot, run, and jump your way out of trouble than you were to do the standard FPS popping in and out of cover thing. All of this is to say that the core experience was excellent because it didn't feel like Halo. It didn't feel like Call of Duty. It felt entirely new. By year 3, the game was a symphony of design. Grinding for gear had achieved a perfect state. Players were consistently being rewarded with fun gear that changed the way you played the game. And for top tier or depressingly committed players like myself, there were god roll weapons to chase, or hard mode raid gear that had actual gameplay benefits, or hidden quests that challenged the team and rewarded them with powerful weapons. The progression system was still too simple, and build diversity was a bit shallow, but it had begun to achieve its promise. And while it wasn't a massively multiplayer game, and it wasn't the FPS MMORPG of our dreams, it was at least an FPS MMORPG light, and it was certainly a hell of a start. For your average committed Destiny player, they were hoping for the sequel to deepen the RPG part of the game, and hopefully make the MMO part of the game massive by only being on the current generation of hardware. Instead, Destiny 2, to the horror of fans, is not an FPS MMORPG. It isn't even an FPS MORPG. It's an FPS MG. This is not what the people who love Destiny wanted. Most of the negative reviews for Destiny focused on 3 things, and only one of those things actually mattered to the millions who'd played the game religiously. Release reviews panned Destiny for a ham-fisted, incoherent lack of narrative, for an intense amount of grinding, and for there not being enough to do in the game. But the people who were excited to play Destiny, who stuck around for 3 years and loved the game by the end, are the same people who wanted an FPS MMORPG. Many of them were current or former MMO players. Long grinding wasn't a problem for these people. It was a feature of the game that they loved. And the narrative issues? Would Destiny have been a better game with a great story? Sure, but I'm gonna let you in a little secret here. Destiny 2's story is utter garbage. It's a cliched pile of tropes, with only a few occasional seconds of actual character depth. Is it better than Destiny 1? Yes, because Destiny 1 quite literally barely had a story at all. But while the worst network television dreck is better than nothing, that doesn't mean it's particularly compelling. Destiny 1 had no story, and Destiny 2 has a shit story, and it doesn't matter to the people who love the game at all. Let's go back to the MMO side for a moment. World of Warcraft has fantastic lore, but the actual narrative story of the base game and the expansions aren't remotely interesting, and no one cares. World of Warcraft expansions set up a big bad, tell you he/she is a threat to everyone and everything, and then set you loose to fish, and mine, and brew potions, and kill 10 kobolds for some dude, and find 15 MacGuffins in a cave in between each actual story moment. And nobody cares at all. The MMO genre isn't built upon story content. Lore is more important than story because it allows a deeper examination of the world without annoyingly getting in the way of what MMO players are there to do, which is play with many other people, grind for loot, and take part in mechanically complex co-op endgame activities. Now, Destiny 1 actually would have gotten this right with even a minimally competent story. One like, say, for instance, Destiny 2's minimally competent story. It had deep, complex, and compelling lore, the world exploration told its own story, and none of that ever got in the way of what players were there to do, which is shoot aliens in the face with friends until guns and armor spew out of their corpses. Focusing a huge amount of development energy on the game's narrative was a mistake from the start. It's very hard to craft a compelling narrative that you can sell to 11-year-old kids. Bungie was never going to be able to tell a story that anyone actually cared about and sell it to everyone, and their core fan base didn't give a hoot about story. You can't have a persistent game lean on its story. Let's give Bungie credit it doesn't deserve, and pretend that they had actually been able to deliver a deep, complex, compelling narrative in Destiny 2. Let's pretend that story was 20 hours of memorable character development and gripping plot. That still wouldn't have mattered, because Destiny was always supposed to be an ongoing, persistent game. World of Warcraft wants you to stick around after you've learned how the story ends. Spoiler, the good guys win. And so does Destiny. And a great story is only really great the first time you hear it. So even if they had succeeded narratively, and again, to be absolutely clear, they didn't, but it still would have done nothing to address what the people who were gonna buy Destiny 2 wanted from the game. I had hundreds of conversations with other Destiny players leading up to Destiny 2, and it was obvious what the actual players of the game wanted. They wanted the quality of life and the amount of content as Year 3 Destiny, with greater build variety, deeper RPG and progression mechanics, and new enemies and worlds to play with. I can't recall one single person telling me they wanted a better story. I don't recall one single person telling me they wanted less gear grinding, and I definitely can't recall one single person telling me they wanted to use their supers and grenades less, and to not have access to both a sniper rifle and a rocket launcher at the same time. Somewhere along the line, Bungie had decided that what was actually wrong with Destiny was Destiny. Supers, powerful abilities, interesting gear, and diverse playstyles, all of these things were toned down or eliminated in Destiny 2. Destiny players wanted new and interesting classes to play with. Instead, they got the same ones, but with less diversity. They wanted more diverse builds. Instead, they got a binary choice of ability set A or ability set B. They wanted gear perks that made the game even wilder and more interesting. Instead, they got gear perks that increased the reload speed of hand cannons by 3%. They wanted Destiny 2 to be a larger game that further delivered on the initial promise of an FPS MMORPG, and instead, they got a narrative FPS game. This points to a level of arrogance at Bungie that should be a lesson going forward. To make a sequel not for the people who loved your game, but for those who had hated your game, is a colossal misstep. We discussed build diversity a moment ago, and this is crucially important to what has gone wrong in Destiny 2. MMOs typically support the intense amount of grinding by giving you a wide variety of gameplay mechanics to use during that grinding. World of Warcraft has a huge amount of character classes, and even in its current extremely streamlined state, the builds within each of those classes offer fundamentally different ways to play the game, depending upon how you spec your character. Added on top of this base system is gear and weapons that further differentiate one playstyle from another. It's clear that while Destiny 1 marketed itself to people who loved these systems, they were actually scared to fully implement them. So instead, Bungie instituted a very modest level and perk system. There were 3 classes that each played differently, and each class had 3 subclasses that further altered your playstyle. Within each of those subclasses, there were only a very few actual build choices to make, and while they did have a discernible impact upon your gameplay, it wasn't that tremendous. Destiny instead put a large amount of the build diversity into the gear. A warlock using bad juju and the obsidian mind was completely different to play than one wearing the nothing manacles and using a shotgun that decreased your grenade cooldown. Looking back, it's clear that a ton of effort went into creating gear-based build diversity. That was pretty good, very fun to play, and was not at all intimidating to FPS players or players with little to no RPG experience. But second games should build upon a foundation. Destiny successfully brought FPS people into an MMO-type game, and they were able to handle it. It's one thing for World of Warcraft to streamline their vanilla progression system, because that system was huge and intimidating. But Destiny's progression system was extremely simple. Simplifying it further has nearly eliminated the varied class play of the first game. In the name of balance, Destiny 2 slows the player down. It drastically increases grenade and super cooldowns. It makes the vast majority of exotic weapons and armor underwhelming pieces that offer only small tweaks to how you play. I'm not even going to get into the insanity of not having gear drop from bosses, but rather having the token system, or the insulting and grotesque microtransactions that went from a small annoyance to a core economy system, or the literally dozens of small simplifications that were made with apparently no audience in mind. Can Destiny 2 be fixed? Yes. But it's impossible to see them doing that because they clearly don't understand who plays their game. They don't understand what those people want from the game, and they're unwilling to give their players the game they want, rather than the game Bungie imagines some untapped market wants. They need to add new enemy types, new classes. They need to drastically deepen the RPG aspects of the game. They need to have much more build diversity than the first game does, not less. They need to balance PvP and PvE separately, like every single other MMO-type game does, because those 2 modes are 2 different modes. They need to go back to the Destiny 1 weapon system. They need to expand the game, not shrink the game. The only people who wanted a smaller, mechanically shallower, more streamlined Destiny are the ones who were never going to play Destiny 2 for more than 10 to 20 hours. The FPS market is not the audience Destiny ever appealed to or was originally intended to service. What this all adds up to is making Destiny a pretty standard FPS game. And people don't play FPS games for 1,000 hours. They play them for 10, 15, 20 hours and then they move on. The entire vision behind making Destiny 2 is so deeply flawed, I'm almost at a loss for how it was possible to fuck this up so badly. I recall saying to a group of raid friends near the end of Destiny's life that what I wanted in a sequel was more Destiny with a couple of new classes and more build diversity and gear, and everyone agreed. Every one of us thought it was a terrible mistake to have a sequel instead of an expansion, but the game had gotten so good by that point, we had faith they'd continue making the game deeper. Instead, what we got is Destiny 2, the game that literally nobody asked for. It's clear they set out to make a game not to please the people who were initially excited for Destiny and played through all the content of Destiny 1, but rather to please the people that despised Destiny. This is almost comically misguided. It ends up being a hell of a lesson about arrogance. It shows just how important it is to know your audience. I'm sure there are people at Bungie who felt the way I and all of my Destiny 1 friends feel. And I'm sure people like Luke Smith felt quite validated when Destiny 2 inexplicably released to glowing reviews. But those glowing reviews were actually proof that something was wrong at the core. Because those reviews are by people who didn't like Destiny. Most likely by people who don't like grindy MMO type games. Those reviews were by people whose opinions really didn't matter. And that's a damn shame because Destiny 1 was the base for a groundbreaking game. It was a base that could have produced a genre-defining game. Instead, Bungie decided they wanted a different audience, and that the people who loved their game were too stupid to realize that what they really wanted was just another shooter after all. Alright, I'd be honored and humbled if you watched the rest of my YouTube videos. And if you watch those videos, I would be tickled pink if you subscribe to this channel. And if you like, comment, and subscribe, I will be absolutely thrilled if you would replace the shingles on my house. I used to be a roofer, but I'm tired and old, and I have no time for that anymore. Thanks.